University of Washington Bothell presents Research in Action. See how UW Bothell faculty apply their academic interests and pursuits to real-life problems, combining research and practice to better serve the greater community.
I'm a full-time lecturer in science and technology with a focus on teaching classes on game design, virtual worlds, and online communities and such. And I'm also director of the Center for Serious Play, which will be starting up here in the fall, which is actually a really exciting initiative. I have kind of a different background. I started out in industry. I actually have worked in the toy and game industry for about 14 years. I worked for such companies as Wizards of the Coast and Hasbro, Xbox Live, Sierra Online, and such. So I bring a perspective into my teaching, which is more industry-based. I came to a point, though, where I decided I wanted to really focus more on giving back to students and giving back to the university. I'm also an alumni of the University of Washington. I have my bachelor's degree, my MBA, and an MA from here. I guess you could say I'm a poster child of the UW. So I really wanted to give something back to the students, and I know that there's a real interest by students in games and this whole industry, and so I thought this would give me an opportunity to really work with students, which is now my passion. The Center for Serious Play I think is really exciting because it's going to look at not just, it's going to serve four different groups as I see it. You have the students, you have the faculty, you have industry, and then you have the community, and I'll talk about each one here. The students, as I said, students today are really growing up playing games. They're very comfortable with games. It used to be that you had this misnomer that games were sort of a certain demographic, psychographic playing them, and what we're finding today is that everyone plays games. And so they're very comfortable with them. So using games as even a learning mechanism for students, I think, is a real comfort to them. What we want to do is also students that have their own ideas for games or want to get into this industry can partner and work with folks from industry on industry projects or on their own projects. And we really want to focus on the three words that come to my mind when I think about this is creativity, innovation, and entrepreneurship, which are a real focus point of University of Washington Bothell. And I think getting the students excited about the creative part, the innovation of what is that next game, what is that next experience, and then the entrepreneurship, really, how could you take this out and maybe start the next game company. This area is a very it's very rich in game industry, is focused right on this corridor here, which gets to the second group that we're going to be focused on, which is industry. And since there are so many game companies and console companies that are right on the east side here, we want to give the industry an opportunity to work with our students here on projects and questions and issues that they might have so that it can be a real collaboration. I think this also will give faculty a great place to go in more of a interdisciplinary. The beauty of the center is it's not focused on one discipline in particular. So you can have faculty from education or from nursing or from computer science or IAS come together and work on projects. It might be that that education wants to look at a certain problem that could be solved or could be taught better to students using games. And so here's a chance for these different groups to come together and problem solve this and work on it together. The final group, I think, is the community. This is a great spot. Again, not only could companies and startups be coming out of the center, but it could be a great forum for K through 12 for younger students to be really coming in who are interested in this. And we're planning on offering workshops and a lecture series in the fall so that people can come in and really talk to some of the experts and some of the real luminaries in the field of games. So we think of this as being a real sort of hot spot for the community as well. In the future, the way we're thinking of the center is really looking at external funding. We are hoping that industries will want to become involved in this. We think we've got great students here, and so why not let them collaborate with them and use the students as internships or such. So we're looking to external funding that way. Certainly, we see opportunities for new money through grants that faculty might not have been able to go after. They can now because of the center and the focus of the center, looking at, again, the sort of using games for more than just entertainment is one aspect, but the whole area of game literacy as an offshoot of media literacy is a whole new field where I think there's a lot of opportunities for funding. There's some interesting work that's been done with immersive environments and games, actually over on the Seattle campus through the HIT Lab, which I'm also affiliated with, the Australian HIT Lab actually, where they've used games to help kids with burn victims at Children's, and they've used games to work with to help reduce the pain. So there are some real applications for games. This whole idea that I mentioned of game literacy, ways to teach. Stepping back a moment, if you look at games are very complicated systems, and you learn a lot through games, not just from the problem-solving aspects or even the social aspects, but even the creation of them, the process that goes into it. And so one of the unique opportunities, unique aspects that we want to look at is this notion of using games for math. How do you learn, what are the aspects of mathematics that you can learn through games? Coming from Wizards, we saw a lot of applications with Magic the Gathering. You're doing a lot of game balancing, statistical analysis and such, all coming through the use of the game, this notion of almost stealth learning. And so we see opportunities to use games, the creation of, not just the playing of, for science and physics and mathematics and such. So we see some opportunities there. It's a field that's quite frankly is growing right now, and it's one that a lot of people are starting to look at. So I think there's those kind of aspects as well that we'll be focused on. My focus has always been in industry and such as I'm focused on the player experience. And so my focus is more on the cognitive and the psychological aspects of gaming and how people play games and how people play, because play is a way to learn, as I think a lot of us have learned over time. So I look at more of the dynamics of the games, not so much focused on the animation and such, which is important, but I'm looking at how does this particular environment work with this particular group of players or with this particular audience. Certainly you can have simulations in games and such, and I think a lot of people don't realize the different aspects of games. That's not just first-person shooters, but that there are simulations. There's the social dynamics that go on in games. I mean, we are social creatures, and clearly games allow us that relationship with other people. It's not as isolating, I think, as people think they are. We're going to be located in the Truly House, which is on the UW-Bothell campus, and it's actually being redone right now so that we can open up in the fall. So students can certainly come up there. What we're planning on doing is having a lecture series, as I mentioned, and studio classes. So we have a number of projects that we're working with industry now to start up, and we'll be looking for students to work on those with different skill sets. We're also talking about starting a degree program in interactive media technology, and that will be another way that students can get involved in it. But I think over this year in particular, you'll be seeing more game-oriented classes and more elements of that, and more elements of fun and play on the campus to sort of talk about it. As I said, it's a pretty exciting initiative, and so I think we'll be getting the word out, and I think we'll have lots of students that want to get involved. I'm a gamer from way back, and so gaming is my passion. And my area of research is in, again, looking at games to use. Clearly, I've looked at them from the entertainment perspective, but I want to find this notion of what they call serious games I think is too serious. So I call it more applied gaming. But looking at ways that you can use the lessons learned from game design in other aspects. I also am interested in issues of gender and getting more women involved in the game industry. If you look at the statistics, you have well over 40% of the gaming population is female, yet you have less than 10% are actually working in the industry. And there's a number of us that really want to change that. And I think with the new generations coming up, we can do that. So that's another area, is how we can use games and this sort of technology to help women get more into these variety of fields.
I'm an assistant professor in the nursing program here at UWB. And the focus of my work is mostly teaching, but part of my, I have scholarship activities that are around research, and particularly research with individuals, communities, and families dealing with incarceration. This research came out of my dissertation research, which was a study looking at African American men as they left prison. I was interested in finding out what was it like to be an African American man in prison, and then what happened to you once you came back into the community. The men told me amazing stories about, first off, that nobody had ever asked them about leaving prison and what that was like, and really wanted to emphasize that it wasn't so much that something could be done for them at this stage, but that they had left behind families and children and partners. And because of their multiple trips in and out of prison, often they had lost contact with those family members. So they really felt as if someone should look at what was happening for women who had a partner in prison, or women who were raising children of men who were in prison. So my first study following the dissertation work was a small study where I talked to women who had male partners in prison, asking if they were even interested in participating in medical or health-related research. And the women were really generous with their time and said, this is completely, we would do anything that you want us to do research-wise. But their caveat was that we also hear about what happens and what we can do to maintain the relationship with our partner. So that led to a second study, which is currently going on, where we're talking with 50 women to ask, what are the health issues that come up for you? And what are the major problems that you have parenting your child? So this population of women, nobody really has looked at them in depth to ask questions about health or psychosocial health. A lot of the questioning tends to be around, and the research tends to be around their interaction with the men, or interaction with regard to sexually transmitted diseases or communicable disease. And there's also a body of research on visiting and seeing a partner in prison. But nobody's really asked, what is your level of health, and are you healthy? What kinds of things help you maintain your health, or what barriers exist to being healthy? And so I'm hoping that this research will move in that direction. The other part of this is work that my colleague, Dr. Wanda Gregory, is doing, looking at parenting issues, parenting challenges and concerns that moms who have a partner in prison, or where the child's father is in prison, what kinds of things they happen in their lives that interfere or enhance parenting. Well, we're really early in the study at this point. We've only talked to a few women. We're hoping to we have probably another 40-plus women to talk to. And so it's difficult to say anything conclusively. But some of the issues that are coming up are that these are really compelling women to talk to. They're very smart. They're very into parenting, the women who have children with them. There is a population of women who have partners in prison but don't have their children with them, have already lost their children to the state system, or have children who are living with family members or other relatives. But these women have their children, and so far there's a lot of conversation around the struggles that they have, either staying away from a partner that they know isn't really helpful for them, or how they keep their children interacting with a father who's away from the home for so much of the time. Right now we have 2 students. We have a graduate student who is our research assistant who's helping with the interviewing. And we have a new graduate student. She's just completed her bachelor's degree. She's in interdisciplinary arts and sciences. And she's going to help with the data analysis section, as well as she's really helped us with the startup. So it's a study that we are really excited to have a couple of students working with us. And it's kind of a new event for me as an investigator to have students working with me. The original study, the first study looking at research participation for women who had a partner in prison, that was funding that came out of a health disparities center grant at the University of Washington School of Nursing. That research was funded in 2004, 2005. This funding is intramural funding. It comes from TSEP funds here on campus. We got a little over $10,000 to complete this study. In the future, we're hoping that some findings from this study will then help me write a grant to National Institutes of Health, either to the Institutes of, to NIDA for drug abuse, or to NINR for nursing research. Also, I'll be looking at some foundation grants to see if there's some foundation that's really interested in parenting or women's health that might be interested in funding this research in the future. Over time, I expect that this research, I'm hoping that will have some finding that will help women overall think about how can they take care of themselves in ways that help them become better parents and better moms that will ultimately keep their children out of prison. Because that's the overarching idea of working with families who are dealing with incarceration. The data suggests that children who have parents in prison, children who have issues with school failure, they have issues with behavioral problems, and those kids often themselves end up repeating this cycle and ending up in prison. So my theory is that if we can sustain and strengthen moms and teach them how to take care of themselves, by being stronger mothers, they can then work more closely with their children to keep their children from going down these paths toward earlier repeated incarceration. So it's research that hopefully will work on this issue of intergenerational incarceration. I teach several courses here at UWB. One is, occasionally I teach the critical thinking course, which is the first course that RN to Bachelor of Science in Nursing students come into the program. It's the first course they take and kind of gets people who haven't been in school a long time situated back into school, back into writing, back into reading, and thinking about ways to process information. I also teach on a fairly regular basis, actually every year, and sometimes a couple times a year, the research course on evidence-based practice. And I use a lot of the examples to help students understand what research is like through real examples, real life things that and studies I've been involved with. So not just the work that I'm doing now with the folks who are dealing with incarceration, but previous studies. I've been on a large NIMH grant during my postdoc where we looked at marital discord parenting and child outcomes. And that was a 5-year NIH multi-million-dollar study. And I use a lot of examples from that because we used a lot of different data collection means to understand and gather data related to parenting and scaffolding children and problem solving between parents and children, comparing those ideas.
So at the University of Washington Bothell, I'm a professor of ecology and conservation biology, and I work in the interdisciplinary arts and sciences program. And my general area of research is in trying to understand how populations react to different kinds of stresses and trying to predict the fates of populations, because I'm interested in the conservation of animals and plants. But increasingly over time, I've also gotten very interested in how we can develop sustainable livelihoods that sustain human populations and sustain wildlife populations. So my work has a kind of combination of and a real diversity of foci. Well, one of the projects that I've been involved in for a very long time has been to look at the population fate of a wildflower. And while wildflowers, I think, enrich our lives because they're so beautiful, But I picked the species that I work with. It's a species that grows only in California in the Napa Valley. So that's an unfortunate place to have to work, but I put up with it. And this wildflower is kind of a model for me of a lot of populations that are separated. Little groups of individuals live in one area, and then there'll be a long distance where there are no individuals, and then there'll be another group. And a lot of populations are separated across, especially as human populations fill in areas that had once been continuous blocks of one type of habitat. Now they're kind of a mosaic of human and wild habitats. And so I'm curious about how these different kinds of populations function. And what I found over working with this plant for over a decade is that in some ways they do pretty well. The littlest populations are the most vulnerable, and the reason why is that pollinators can't find them. And so, and when they do find them, they're not carrying any pollen from the species. They've traveled so far, and they've been going to other plants, they bring the wrong species pollen to these plants. And so they just fail to reproduce, and eventually the little population dies out. Another long-term project of mine has been in Puerto Rico. I've worked with Jaime Callazo, who's at the North Carolina State University, and he and I and our graduate students have been very interested in how land use in Puerto Rico has affected bird communities. And in Puerto Rico, a lot of people may not know, but when it was first colonized by the Spanish, almost the entire island was deforested for sugarcane. They also grew a lot of coffee, and it turns out that the coffee plantations, for coffee to grow well, it requires a canopy to shade the coffee beans, and the coffee beans then develop slowly, and that gives you the really good coffee taste that we Seattleans, Northwesterners love. And these coffee plantations really are like forests. They're not that different from the primary forest. And so amazingly, even though almost the entire island lost all of its forest cover over about 50 years, most of the bird species still persist on Puerto Rico, and a lot of them are endemic. That is, they're only found on Puerto Rico. So we were really curious about how coffee helped birds, to see whether it really did. And we were also really curious to see coffee practices have been changing over time. And now a lot of people grow coffee in the full sun. And the U.S. Department of Agriculture was encouraging Puerto Ricans to shift from growing coffee in the shade, which is a slower process and it doesn't yield as much as growing it in the full sun. And so we made comparisons of what was happening to bird communities, and one of our students, Rina Bocataria, also looked at lizards and insects in these sun plantations versus the shade plantations. And like people in other places, we have seen there is a huge difference. There are vastly greater numbers of individual birds and lizards and insects in the shaded plantations, and the diversity of those species. There's a greater number of species in each of those shaded plantations compared to the sun ones. The other thing that was really exciting to find is that the birds, and particularly the lizards, eat the pests of coffee. So while a lot of people focus on this as, what's in it for the birds and the bees, we found out that actually these animals are benefiting the coffee farmers. And the coffee farmers who have shaded plantations use much lower levels of pesticides than do those who have to grow their coffee in the sun. After I worked in Puerto Rico for a long time, I teamed up with another student here at the UW, whose name is Juan Carlos Martinez Sanchez. And he had worked for a long time in Nicaragua as a conservationist, and he helped establish a protected area there. And in the process, right around the major land use was coffee also. But Nicaragua is different than Puerto Rico. All of the coffee's in the shade. And the biggest question he had was there was a big push for organic cultivation. And on the face of it, everyone would say that's a great thing because you lower the use of chemicals that can be harmful to the environment or to human health. So here's something great to do. But as he was talking to the farmers, he realized how difficult it was for them to get the certification, that their yields were suffering. And coffee farmers often live very much on the margin. It's a difficult existence in a lot of ways. It's very pleasant to work in a coffee farm, but you don't get rich doing it. And so we teamed up, and in part because I've been here at the University of Washington Bothell, I have been working with social scientists who helped me understand how we could survey coffee farmers in a rigorous way and really understand what their problems were, and connect that to what was going on in the biological realm. And so what we found was actually organic plantations and regular plantations where they use pesticides, where they use synthetic fertilizers, are absolutely equal for plant diversity and for bird diversity. They are great places to hang out. So there was no gain, seemingly, but there was an enormous cost. The farmers were earning at least 1/3 less, and it came down to that they couldn't use these synthetic fertilizers. And so if they could add the fertilizers, they would be able to make the same profits that any other coffee farmer there would. And so what's been exciting about that is now Juan Carlos is working with a number of individuals and trying to see if there are ways to change regulations so that you could still have the gain of not using these pesticides that are so harmful, but you could allow the fertilizers and have the label of organic. You still try to turn it into a win-win. One of the things that's been very important to me is to be sure that there's a very strong set of opportunities for students to define new projects within projects that I've been working on. One of the places I've had the most success has been in my project in Puerto Rico with Jaime Collazo. We've had 5 graduate students get their master's or PhDs with us. We also have worked with a number of Puerto Rican undergraduates to provide them with training. And of those, 6 of them have gone on for graduate study, which has been really exciting. One of the folks who worked with us initially doing his master's work with us is Tomas Carlo. He's now a professor at Penn State. And when he did his master's work with us, one of the exciting things that he realized was that shaded coffee plantations aren't all equal. And he got really excited about this, and we would talk late into the night about how this might be true and how we could try to figure out what the differences were between these different different plantations. And what we ended up doing was looking at how areas where there's not active cultivation happening benefit the birds compared to the areas where they're really actively stimulating coffee. And found out that these resting areas are really important, and that some of the very traditional ways of growing coffee were really much better for birds than were these other ones. So that had been a really exciting side project that would never have happened. It wasn't something that Jaime and I were looking at. It was because Tomas realized the potential there and made that study happen. One of the great joys of being at UW-Bothell is our opportunities for teaching. We teach usually fairly intimate classes, 40 students or fewer, and it gives an opportunity to do a lot of what I call case-based teaching. So I like to bring in issues and questions that are complex. They have many different sides. Students coming with different backgrounds can join into the conversation from their different perspectives, from their different expertise, and try to figure out how we can move forward in solving particular kinds of problems. So often I'll bring problems from my research. So I have, for example, talked about how do we think about these issues with coffee, which is something that resonates in the Northwest. We're all coffee drinkers, to dispel the gloom of the cold and wet days. And so they kind of relate to that viscerally. And so what's nice about that is the problems, because I've worked with the issues in Puerto Rico and I've worked with them in Nicaragua, they are very different situations. And so we can try to start understanding, well, what are the historical and social issues that have led to differences in these two locations, and how does that change what's possible, what's desirable, what biological similarities are there between some place that's part of a continent versus a tiny island out in the Caribbean. They have very different ecological situations as well, so how does that change that conversation? So it gives these ways to learn about a real host of issues, but it's real, and it's based in places that I've been to, and often I have students who have been, maybe not to those two places, but they've been to other locations, and they can talk about, well, gosh, when I was in Colombia, this is what I saw. And so it brings a reality to the principles and the ability to critically reason through difficult problems that I think more conventional lecture-based teaching would never bring.
The goals of the work that I'm doing in the Cascades of North Central Washington really center on how nonvascular plants play ecological roles in alpine ecosystems. Our alpine ecosystems are increasingly under human threat from climate change. As climate warms, tree line will become higher, and the alpine area that we have here in Washington will decrease, is expected to decrease very significantly. And we think that these non-vascular plants, which coat the surface of the soil, we call them cryptobiotic crusts, we think that these organisms play very substantial roles in establishing the meadow vegetation that you see in the mountains, in maintaining the nutrient cycling of these ecosystems, in allowing young plants to establish, to trap seeds. There's a variety of roles that these cryptobiotic crusts have been demonstrated to play in work that I've done in the Arctic and work that many people have done in cold desert regions around Nevada and Utah and cold grassland areas. But we know very little of what they do in the alpine, and this is something that we're really hoping we can establish much more of their ecological roles. And once we understand the ecological roles that these organisms play, it'll be much easier for us to restore damaged areas. We can use these organisms to seed an area and thus then get meadow vegetation and shrubs reestablished, get habitat reestablished for organisms like pikas, for instance, small mammals that are now currently dwindling in populations in the Cascades. Most of what we study in these cryptobiotic crusts are lichens, which are associations of fungi and algae. Some of these lichens actually have blue-green bacteria in them, which take nitrogen out of the air and incorporate it into the soil. And this could be very important in alpine ecosystems, which are usually have soils that are very poor in nitrogen and difficult for plants to function without that. We also study mosses up there, which coat the surface of the soil in some instances, and these mosses themselves can change the temperature of the soil. It turns out that one of the greatest threats to seedlings of alpine plants is overheating. The surfaces of the soil can get 130, 140 degrees Fahrenheit on a sunny day up there, and it just cooks these seedlings. But if they're embedded in a moss mat that's wetter, their temperatures are a little more favorable, and thus they might survive that. So we're interested in these moss mats for a variety of reasons. There's also blue-green bacteria, as I mentioned, in the lichens, but also free-living blue-green bacteria, fungi, other sorts of organisms like that occur in these cryptobiotic crusts. The cryptobiotic crust that we work with is actually very variable. If you were to go up to the alpine and look, you would see on some surfaces of the soil, you would see basically a carpeting of moss. And that's one type of cryptobiotic crust. In other areas, there can be a mat of lichens that are up there. Either lichens like you see on a rock surface that are very flat, that occur just along the surface of the soil, or sometimes you get these very we call them fruticose lichens with lots of hairs on them, big strands of hairs woven together in sort of a cushiony carpet that can be anywhere from 3 to 4 inches in thickness. It's really a very attractive looking carpet of lichens that can occur up there. And you can also get fungi. fungal strands that coat the surface. So some of these look very thin and black. Some of them look very sort of puffy and white-green. They're very variable depending upon the type of crust. We spend the work that I do up in the Alpine allows me to actually go up to some really wonderful places. Most of it occurs out in the Alpine regions. We do some work in the laboratory, but the field work is the centerpiece of what we do. We oftentimes have to hike long distances into some very remote field sites. We carry a lot of things with us. A lot of students come with us. And we take measurements. We set up data recorders to take long-term measurements of the environment, of the microenvironment up there, of soil temperatures, of soil nutrients, of soil moisture, of wind speeds, of air temperatures, temperatures of the plants themselves. We're looking at how plants, especially the vascular plants, the meadow plants and the shrubs, how they perform in areas that have these cryptobiotic crusts and in areas that don't. And we also do manipulative experiments where we remove crusts from certain areas around plants and we add crusts to other areas around plants. And we look at how plants handle drought under those conditions, what their water status is. We look at their ability to photosynthesize, to make sugars, to grow. We look at their temperatures and what effect these crusts have on temperatures. So we do a lot of very small scale measurements. We take plants back to the laboratory for study of their biomass to see what sort of mass was produced under different conditions. In the laboratory itself, we have several studies that involve students taking the lead on them. We look at the germination of seeds that come from plants that were growing in different areas. We actually can take these cryptobiotic crusts back and we can look at how well they can transform nitrogen from the air into the soil. And those sorts of studies allow us to develop a better understanding of exactly what's going on in the field in much more controlled circumstances. My favorite alpine plant is something called purple saxifrage. It's a plant that occurs in the Cascades and in the Olympic Mountains, but only on basically north-facing cliffs. That's about the only place we find that plant. It's doesn't get much further south than Washington State, really. It's an Arctic species that creeps its way down into the Cascades, and it can handle our climate by occupying these very steep north-facing cliffs that rarely see full sun or direct sunlight. The black lily is a species of lily, obviously, that occurs all the way from northern Japan around the Pacific Rim up through the Kuril Islands, the Kamchatka Peninsula, across onto the Aleutian Island chain, and then following around on the Alaskan coast, down the Alaskan Panhandle through British Columbia. And it ends in its distribution pretty much in Snohomish County here in Washington State. There are a couple of populations down in Oregon that are what we call disjunct, that don't disconnected from the Washington populations. But aside from that, it really reaches its limit here in Washington State. It was a plant that was used, the black lily was used by native peoples throughout the range. I know more about its use by the coastal Salish peoples in British Columbia and in our region. I haven't studied it its use outside of our region. It is also known as locally as Indian rice root, and that name is more descriptive. If you dig up the bulb of the lily, it looks like a whole bunch of little rice kernels sort of glued together into a ball. And it's very starchy. It was used as a food plant largely. Nowadays, it doesn't represent so much of a food source for native tribes, but it does represent a tie to traditional cultures, to the culture that these tribes thrived with for many hundreds, if not thousands of years. And thus, this plant is one species that many of the tribes, including the Tulalip tribes, who I work with up in near Everett, north of Everett, really value and want to see maintained, particularly within the range of their reservations, their current reservations. It grows in Washington. It's ecologically very interesting to me because it grows in salt marshes. The only place in salt marshes it grows is on rotting logs. There are a few exceptions to that. Anytime you say the only place, there's always an exception. But generally, you only find it at high tide levels on old rotting logs above where the water usually covers. The other place that this plant grows is in acidic meadows or wetlands up in subalpine areas that tend to be very heavy snowfall areas in the Cascades, areas where we find Alaskan vegetation as well. And these are the two places it occurs, and it doesn't really occur in between. And to me, this was very curious. I got interested in it actually because of a student in one of my classes who happened to be a volunteer for the Washington Department of Natural Resources, and she was monitoring the black lily up in the mountains. And at the same time, a colleague of mine working with the Tulalip tribes was monitoring this plant in salt marshes. And we got together and talked about this. And all of us were very interested in why this plant can grow in such different places. And understanding those sorts of things are really critical to maintaining the population of a plant like black lily, which is currently listed as a sensitive species in Washington State. It's not quite threatened or endangered, but it's on that list. There's actually not a lot of information published about the black lily. You'll find a little bit more in some of the popular plant guidebooks that are available for people to take out to the field and identify plants. There are some good books on what we call ethnobotany, or the use of plants by native peoples. It's a good book by a professor at the University of Victoria, Nancy Turner, on called Plant Technology of First Nations peoples. And I recently published an article in a journal called Douglasia, which is a magazine that the Washington Native Plant Society publishes, and that it would introduce people to the biology of black lily. One of the major efforts of mine in the 10 years that I've been here at University of Washington Bothell has been to establish and oversee the University of Washington Restoration Ecology Network. This is a tri-campus network, Tacoma, Bothell, and Seattle, of students and faculty that come from a variety of academic disciplines, all of whom are interested in furthering the cause of restoring damaged ecosystems, many times ecosystems in urban or suburban areas, but even in rural areas or further afield in more wilderness types of settings. People come from all sorts of backgrounds interested in this, from education, from geology, from plant biology, from geography, landscape architecture, engineering, and so on. And we saw an opportunity to really bring people together to understand how to restore these ecosystems more effectively by viewing it as an interdisciplinary endeavor. And so 10 years ago, we started this University of Washington Restoration Ecology Network, and one of the things that is a key component of what we do is what we call our Restoration Ecology Capstone. It's a year-long experience where students from all 3 campuses come together, and they come from various disciplines, and we put them into restoration teams of mixed discipline background, and we partner them with a community partner in a restoration project. And so they're working outside of the university. They're really pushed, student teams are pushed to connect the disciplinary learning that they have done through their first 3 years being at the university into applying it in a real-world setting. So they take their botany background or their engineering background or their education background, and they apply it to these projects that are done in conjunction with a community partner. And these projects, we've run over 70 projects now, and they've been varying in their success. Some are widely successful and some are more moderately successful. But they're very successful from the point of view of students. The students get a lot out of it, and we hear that constantly. Our alumni are pretty much in constant contact with us. Once they've done a year-long project like this, there's a lot of ownership that the students feel. And we've seen these projects as an opportunity to really explore what makes a successful restoration. There's an awful lot of ecological restoration going on around our region, around the country, around the world right now because of the impacts of humans on natural systems. And it's really a field. Restoration ecology is a field that is relatively new, and we're still learning what critical factors make for a successful project. And we now have both graduate students and undergraduate students working on studies to look at our past capstone projects because we have such a rich accumulation of different types of projects to try to understand how well these projects worked, how well they worked ecologically, how well they worked to foster community education in ecological literacy, we call it, how well they worked to bring the community together as stewards of the land, how well they worked for the students themselves and for the clients or our community partners and their goals. So we're doing that now with a team of both graduate and undergraduate students who are trying to understand these sorts of questions. The outcome of these studies will really probably show up in a number of graduate theses and dissertations initially. There will be outcomes from the undergraduate student studies that will be more directly put into publications, probably regional publications of organizations that are interested in how restoration works or does not work in our region. We've had a number of students make presentations at the Society for Ecological Restoration meetings, the regional conferences. The students who do put their work, the graduate students who put their work into theses and dissertations will probably be publishing that work in peer-reviewed scientific journals to try to get this information out to the scientific community. The rest of that, the bulk of that information will also be going into a new textbook that's coming out probably in a few years that we're working on right now on ecological restoration that will hopefully guide not just academicians but practitioners, people out there on the ground with their hands in the soil doing the work to restore systems.
For more information about research in action at University of Washington Bothell, please visit www.uwb.edu/research or call 425-352-3636.